Jack Turner never believed a single moment could break a man twice. But on that cold November evening, as the wind slapped against the thin walls of his trailer, he learned it could. The knock on his door was soft, almost apologetic, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. By the time he opened it, by the time he saw the thick yellowed envelope with his full name written in careful ink, something inside him already knew his world was about to shift again. Jack Turner had once been respected across the Montana range. He had ridden tall, managed cattle with steady hands, and built a ranch he thought would stand for generations. But life had a cruel way of taking its dues. His wife's accident took her strength, and the bills that followed took his land, his pride, and nearly every piece of himself he still valued. Now he lived alone in a dented trailer, drinking bitter coffee, counting quiet hours, and trying not to remember who he used to be. The envelope in his hands trembled. Jacob Turner, the name he hadn't used since he was a boy, etched in the familiar handwriting of Uncle Henry Whitfield. Henry had been a strange man, distant from the rest of the family, choosing to live alone in Snake River Valley with nothing but apple trees and an Appaloosa horse for company. People whispered about him. Some said he was odd. Some said he was touched in the head. Jack had never known which to believe. He sat at the table, the cold lamp casting shadows as he broke the seal. Henry was gone. The words sat heavy and final, and with his passing, he had left Jack one last thing. 100 acres of land in Idaho, a rotting orchard falling into ruin, and an old Appaloosa horse named Sundance. Jack laughed once, a dry sound with no humor. An orchard. A dying one. And a horse nearly as old as the land itself. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a reminder of how far he had fallen, of the life he had lost, of how little he had left to offer the world. But the letter lingered in his hands, and the silence in that trailer pressed too hard against his chest. Jack had no ranch left, no future laid out, and no more roads to run. For the first time in months, he had a direction, even if it was a foolish one. The next morning, he loaded his old Ford pickup with everything he had left. The heater didn't work. The engine groaned with every mile, and the winter wind sliced through the cab. But he drove on through the mountains, through snow-tipped ridges and lonely valleys, until the land rolled down toward the place Uncle Henry had called home. By the time Jack pulled up the dirt road to the orchard, dusk had settled like a bruise. The land looked more like a graveyard than anything living. Apple trees leaned crooked and broken, bark blackened and peeling. The ground was covered in rotting fruit, the smell thick and sour in the cold air. Every tree looked as though it had given up long ago. And then Jack saw him. Sundance stood behind a sagging fence, motionless as stone. His once bright Appaloosa coat had faded to gray, his mane tangled, his body thin. But his eyes, those eyes were steady, dark, almost knowing. Jack stopped beside his truck, staring back at the animal. The valley was silent, the air sharp, and for a strange moment Jack felt as though Sundance had been waiting for him. Not for Henry, not for the ranch, but for him. He shook the thought away. He didn't believe in signs, not anymore. Jack crossed the yard, his boots sinking into the soft, rotting ground. Everything smelled of decay, of years lost and forgotten. The porch sagged under his weight as he stepped into the old house. Dust hung thick in the air. Furniture sat where it had decades ago. A rocking chair, a table with knife marks worn deep, shelves lined with jars clouded by age. It felt like walking into a place that time had abandoned. Jack dropped his bag and sank into the nearest chair. The orchard groaned outside, wind scraping the branches together like whispers. He thought of Henry living out his years in this silence, thought of the loneliness that must have wrapped around him like a second skin. The house seemed to breathe around him. When he stepped outside again, night had taken the valley. Sundance stood closer to the porch now, breath steaming in the cold. Jack watched him quietly. "Don't look at me like that," Jack muttered. "I'm no savior." The horse flicked an ear but didn't move. Inside the house, Jack found a small tin box on Henry's nightstand. Inside, it was nothing but a broken watch and an old photograph of the orchard in bloom. White blossoms glowing bright under a spring sun. The image didn't match the ruin outside the window. Not anymore. Jack lay on the sagging bed, the photo resting on his chest, listening to Sundance paw at the ground outside. The sound was steady, rhythmic, almost like a signal. Almost like a message. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. Just a horse, restless in the cold. But as he drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, the valley seemed to whisper around him. The orchard groaning. The wind scraping. Sundance digging at the earth with a purpose Jack didn't yet understand. And by morning, when the frost spread pale across the land and the rot stung sharper in the air, Jack felt something inside him shift. Not hope. Not yet, but a pull. A question wrapped in the old horse's quiet stare. Something was wrong here, something hidden. And Sundance, for reasons Jack couldn't name, seemed to know exactly where to find it. Jack woke with the valley wrapped in a thin gray fog, the kind that hid more than it revealed. The orchard stretched silent before him, a graveyard of broken branches and rotting apples. Sundance stood near the fence, breath drifting in pale clouds, watching Jack with a patience that felt older than the land itself. Jack stepped off the porch, boots crunching through frost-hardened earth. He didn't know why, but he walked straight toward the horse. Maybe because Sundance was the only living thing here that didn't feel like a stranger. Maybe because something in Henry's letter still echoed in his mind. Trust the horse. Sundance snorted softly as Jack approached, then turned his head toward the far end of the orchard, ears pricked, body tense. Jack followed the gaze. The fog clung thickest there, blanketing the rows of twisted trees until they looked like ghosts, standing shoulder to shoulder. "You expect me to go in there?" Jack muttered. The horse stepped forward once, the message clear. Jack sighed and started walking. The deeper he moved into the orchard, the colder the air became. The smell of rot stung his nose. Fallen apples squished under his boots. The branches above twisted together, forming a dark, tangled ceiling that shut out the morning light. Halfway down the path, Jack noticed something he hadn't seen before. The ground near one of the oldest trees had been disturbed, soft, loose, as if someone or something had dug there recently. Sundance pawed the ground behind him, urging him closer. Jack crouched and brushed away the damp leaves. His fingers struck wood. A box, small and weathered, buried shallow in the soil. His pulse quickened. He dug it free and pried it open. Inside lay photographs, old and grainy. Men in suits walking the orchard rows. Trucks parked under the cover of darkness. Crates being loaded. And Sundance, young, bright-eyed, tethered to a fence, watching everything. Jack's breath caught. Below the photographs were folded papers. Notes, letters, chemical diagrams written in Henry's careful hand. And one line at the bottom of the page stopped Jack cold. "If anyone finds this, trust the horse." He remembers. Jack closed the box, heart pounding. The orchard moaned softly in the wind. Sundance stood behind him, unmoving, dark eyes steady on Jack's every breath. This wasn't just about dying apple trees. Something had happened here. Something big, something buried. Something Henry had carried alone for decades. Jack took the box and followed Sundance back to the house. His hands shook as he set it on the kitchen table. He didn't even have time to catch his breath before a sharp knock rattled through the door. Jack stiffened. Visitors rarely came to this valley, not without a reason. He opened the door to find a woman bundled in a wool coat, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined from years of sun and wind. She held a basket in her hands. "Jack Turner?" she asked. "That's me." "I'm Clara," she said. "I live 2 miles down the road. I used to check in on your uncle when he'd let me." Her eyes drifted past Jack to the orchard. "Thought I'd stop by." Jack stepped aside and she entered the kitchen. Her gaze softened when it fell on the box. "You found something," she said quietly. Jack hesitated. "Did you know about any of this?" Quote. Clara exhaled. "Your uncle wasn't lonely the way people said. He was cautious, careful. He kept to himself because he had reason to. She looked out the window at Sundance, standing calm and steady outside. That horse. Henry trusted him more than anyone, said Sundance could sense trouble before it walked through the gate. Jack rubbed his jaw. Henry was strange. Not strange, Clara replied gently. Just carrying more than most men can bear. She reached across the table, placing her hand near the photographs. Those men came here once, she whispered. Back in the 80s. They walked the orchard with clipboards, loaded crates into unmarked trucks. Henry never talked about it, but I saw enough to know he didn't trust them. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. What were they taking? He asked. Clara shook her head. Samples, fruit, soil, whole branches, and they didn't want anyone asking questions. The room grew quiet. The old clock on the wall ticked loud in the silence. Sundance pawed the ground outside, steady, deliberate. Clara stood, pulling her coat tight. Your uncle wanted someone in the family to carry this, she said. Maybe he believed you could finish what he couldn't. Jack swallowed. I'm no hero, Clara. No, she said softly, but you're here. And sometimes that's enough. She stepped out into the cold and disappeared down the path. Jack watched her until a fog swallowed her completely. When he turned back, Sundance stood pressed against the fence, head lifted, eyes fixed on him with a look Jack couldn't explain. A look that said, this is only the beginning. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the windows. The house creaked. And Sundance pawed the earth outside, slow and relentless, as if trying to wake something buried deeper than the orchard's roots. Jack lit the lamp and opened the box again. Henry's notes lay scattered on the table like broken pieces of a truth too big to grasp. Government visits, experiments, compounds, samples hidden, strange men walking the roads at night, and always Sundance, watching. Jack stood, shaking, and moved to the window. The orchard stretched in darkness. Sundance stood alone in the moonlight, ears forward, staring at the far edge of the valley where the trees grew thickest. It wasn't random. It wasn't restlessness. The horse was pointing toward something. Something Henry had tried to hide. Something someone would come back for. Jack whispered into the night, "What are you trying to show me, old boy?" Sundance turned his head toward the ridge. And Jack felt the first true spark of fear and purpose ignite inside him. The storm arrived before the danger did. Jack felt it in the air long before the clouds broke. The valley went still, birds vanishing from the branches, the wind falling dead. Even the rotting orchard seemed to hold its breath. Sundance paced the fence line, ears pinned flat, body tense in a way Jack had never seen. Something was coming. Inside the house, Megan worked fast at the kitchen table. Papers, photos, and Henry's notes were spread before her. She had arrived just a day earlier after Jack's desperate call, bringing with her a reporter's instinct and a courage Jack hadn't known he would need. Now anger sharpened her every word as she pieced together decades of deceit. "These tests were the foundation for billion-dollar medicines," she whispered. And they stole it from him, buried him with silence. Jack didn't answer. His eyes kept drifting to the window. Sundance hadn't stopped moving. Lightning ripped across the sky, lighting the orchard like a ghost world. Thunder rolled so close it rattled the glass panes. Rain followed in sheets, pounding the earth, rolling through the valley like a river. Jack stepped outside just as Sundance screamed, a raw, piercing sound that cut straight through the storm. That was when Jack saw the headlights. Two black SUVs crawled up the muddy road, slow and deliberate. The kind of slow that meant confidence, the kind that meant they believed nothing could stop them. "Megan!" Jack shouted, bolting back inside. She was already on her feet, phone in hand, gathering the files. But the house shook as the men exited their vehicles, their silhouettes sharp against flashes of lightning. Sundance reared in the paddock, hooves striking sparks off stone. Jack grabbed Henry's old rifle from the wall, but Megan's hand closed around his arm. "You can't shoot your way through this," she said. Not against them. They're not here to talk, Jack whispered. No, she agreed. They're here to erase. The storm raged louder. The orchard bent and howled. And Sundance stood braced against the wind, wild-eyed, waiting for Jack to move. We have to go, Megan said. Now. Jack didn't need convincing. He grabbed the waterproof bag packed with the newest evidence. The sealed jars, the signed reports, the preserved samples Henry had hidden. The older documents remained buried in the attic floorboards. There was no time to gather everything. Flashlights cut through the orchard. Men shouted. Boots splashed through mud. Jack sprinted out the back door. Sundance met him instantly, pressing his forehead against Jack's chest. Rain lashed at them, wind tearing at Jack's jacket, but the horse stood firm, waiting for the only command he'd ever truly needed. Take us, Jack whispered. Please. Sundance wheeled around, muscles bunching beneath his soaked coat, and lunged forward. Jack held tight to his mane as they sprinted into the orchard, Megan racing behind them, branches slapping her arms and face as she kept pace. Flashlights swept behind them, voices shouting, growing closer. The storm lit the world in flashes of white and black. Sundance climbed the ridge trail as if he'd done it 1,000 times. Jack's boots slid over wet rock, but the horse steadied him each time, pulling him upward, refusing to let him fall. Lightning struck a fallen tree near the trail, splintering wood into the air. Megan screamed but kept moving. Sundance leapt over the debris, hooves gripping the slick slope as though guided by something deeper than instinct. At last, they reached the plateau, hidden high above the valley, sheltered by stone outcrops. Jack collapsed against the rocks, chest heaving, rainwater streaming down his face. Megan dropped beside him, trembling. Below them, the men's flashlights flickered through the orchard like angry fireflies. They hadn't found the trail. Not yet. Sundance stood at the cliff's edge, chest rising and falling, legs quivering from the climb, but his eyes remained sharp, watching, guarding. Jack pushed wet hair from his eyes. He knew this trail. Henry must have shown him. No, Megan said breathlessly. He remembered it. They waited until the storm's fury softened, until the shouts faded into the distance. Only then did Jack unzip the bag. Inside, the sealed vials gleamed under the faint lightning. The papers and notes were soaked at the edges, but intact. The truth was here, undeniable, unstoppable. What Henry kept hidden, Jack whispered, will break them. Megan wiped rain from her face. Then we bring it to the world. And so they did. The weeks that followed were a war. Megan contacted reporters, lawyers, scientists. Federal investigators arrived quietly at first, then loudly. The pharmaceutical giants fought back with every legal trick they had, but the truth Henry had preserved was too strong. The orchard, once forgotten, became the center of one of the biggest corporate scandals the West had ever seen. Evidence surfaced. Patents were traced. Lies unraveled. Headlines roared. Stolen orchard chemicals behind billion-dollar drug fortune. Forgotten rancher exposes 40-year cover-up. The horse that remembered. The orchard slowly began to heal. Jack tended it day after day, clearing rot, cutting back dead limbs, planting new saplings in the rich, dark soil exposed by storms and time. Visitors came to see the place where the truth had been buried, and where one stubborn horse refused to let it die. Jack became quiet famous in a way he never expected, but each time reporters asked him how he uncovered it all, he gave the same answer. I didn't, he said. Sundance did. By the next spring, blossoms returned to the orchard. White petals drifted on the warm breeze, falling softly across Jack's shoulders as he walked the rows. Sundance followed beside him, slower now, but still proud. Jack paused under one of the oldest surviving trees. Young apples were forming, small and green, full of promise. He rested a hand on Sundance's neck. You carried the truth, old boy, Jack whispered. You carried all of us. Sundance pressed his head gently into Jack's chest, a gesture older than words, older than the orchard, older than the secret Henry had spent 40 years protecting. When Megan joined him on the porch that evening, the orchard glowed beneath the sinking sun, alive in every way Jack once feared it never would be. "This place," she said softly, "it was never meant to die." Jack nodded. Neither was the truth. Sundance grazed peacefully nearby, his coat shimmering in the dusk, his shadow long and steady across the land he had guarded for a lifetime. And for the first time since the storm, Jack felt whole again. Because some stories aren't carried in books. Some are carried by horses, and Sundance had carried this one farther than any man ever could.